I had been moving through the house in that familiar quiet, the kind that comes when two people share a life but not a connection. My husband had rushed out again. Another late meeting, another excuse I didn't bother questioning anymore. His friend Daniel had arrived minutes before he left, and the sudden change in plans left the two of us alone without warning. I told him he could stay until the rain slowed, and he agreed, offering a small smile that carried the same polite distance he always held around me. For years he had been this steady presence on the edges of our marriage, never too close, never inappropriate, but always strangely observant. I poured tea to keep my hands busy, listening to the rain hitting the windows with more presence than the man I'd married. When I brought the cup to him, he thanked me in a voice that sounded quieter than usual. I noticed he didn't touch the tea. Instead, he stared at something in his hands. I couldn't see what it was from where I stood, only that his posture looked tense, almost guarded. I tried not to pry, but the discomfort lingered in the air, tugging at my curiosity. The house felt heavier than it should have. I started picking up a few things from the table, clearing away the mess my husband left behind. I moved into the hallway, and that's when something pulled me back toward the living room. A feeling soft, strange, like I had walked away from something I wasn't meant to ignore. When I turned back, Daniel had shifted, and the object he held slipped slightly into view. It was an old photograph, one I remembered clearly, the three of us smiling years ago, back when everything seemed effortless. Before I could stop myself, I stepped closer. He didn't notice until the floor creaked. His hand snapped shut around the picture, and he wiped at his eyes with the back of his sleeve so quickly he almost fooled me. Almost. I had never seen him lose composure, never seen him look anything other than collected and careful with his words. Seeing him like that, unguarded, unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. That I asked gently what was wrong. He tried to dismiss it, mumbling something about long days and old memories. But the tightness in his jaw, the way he avoided my eyes, the tremor in his voice, it was all too real to ignore. After a long pause, he admitted he wasn't doing well, that things in his life had been heavier than he let on, and seeing that photo reminded him of when everything felt simpler. He said he missed those days not because life was easier, but because back then he felt like he belonged somewhere. I stood there, unsure of what to say. It wasn't my place to press him, yet I felt something shift inside me. A strange ache, the kind that comes when you realize someone else notices the distance you've been pretending not to feel. He finally looked at me, not long, not intensely, but enough for me to see something he had never let slip before. Something he didn't mean for me to catch. In that brief moment, I understood two things. He had been carrying far more than he showed, and whatever he felt when he looked at that photo, it wasn't just nostalgia. And that realization startled me more than the tears he tried to hide. I didn't plan to sit beside him, but something in the silence between us pulled me closer. He apologized again for getting emotional, insisting he wasn't trying to burden me. I told him he didn't have to explain. People break sometimes, even the ones who seem the most put together. My voice surprised me, steady, gentle, too honest. He looked up at me then, and for the first time he didn't hide whatever he was feeling. He said he'd been watching things fall apart in his own life. Friendships drifting, work swallowing him, family complications he didn't know how to handle. But then he paused, choosing his next words slowly, as if he were peeling back a layer he'd kept guarded for too long. He said he noticed I wasn't the same either, that the light I used to carry, the one he remembered from years ago, had dimmed so much it scared him. He said it softly, almost afraid of how much truth he was revealing. I felt a sting in my chest, sharper than I expected. People rarely asked how I felt, let alone notice the small changes I hid behind routines and practiced calmness. I didn't respond right away. I didn't trust my voice. He took the silence as discomfort and looked away, apologizing again. But I stopped him before he could fold back into himself. I told him he wasn't wrong. I admitted that I had grown quieter, smaller even, inside a marriage that no longer had room for my feelings. I wasn't trying to complain. It was simply the truth, and saying it aloud made me feel exposed and strangely relieved. He listened, really listened, with a patience I hadn't experienced in years. It made the words keep coming. I told him about the nights spent waiting for conversations that never happened, about the way my husband moved through the house like someone passing through a hotel room, always in a rush to leave. I confessed the part one had never said even to myself, That somewhere along the way I stopped expecting anything from him because expecting only led to disappointment. When I finished, the room felt heavier, but in a way that made breathing easier, not harder. He whispered that he hated seeing me like this. That he wished someone, anyone, had noticed sooner. Then he said something that made the air shift entirely. He told me he always admired how I held things together. How I smiled even when life didn't give me reasons to. How I carried warmth in moments where most people would have grown cold. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't rehearsed. It felt like something he had been holding inside for a long time. I tried to keep the moment from becoming something it shouldn't. But the sincerity in his voice made it impossible to ignore the tension building between us. Not physical tension, emotional. Heavy. Unspoken. He reached for the tea he had ignored earlier, and when our fingers brushed, we both froze. It was the slightest contact, but it said more than anything either of us had spoken. He didn't pull away immediately. I didn't either. It wasn't deliberate. It was instinctive, a quiet agreement we didn't speak of. I finally moved my hand back, but the warmth lingered, unsettling and strangely comforting at the same time. He exhaled shakily, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper. He said he didn't know when it happened, but somewhere along the line he started caring about my happiness more than he should have. He didn't ask for anything, didn't cross any line. He just said the truth he had been swallowing for years. I felt the words settle inside me in a place I had long forgotten. An untouched corner that remembered what it felt like to be noticed, valued, held gently in someone's thoughts. It frightened me. It soothed me. It made me feel something I thought I'd lost. And in that moment, without meaning to, I helped him by telling him he wasn't alone in feeling something he shouldn't have felt. I didn't encourage it. I didn't deny it. I simply acknowledged it, and that alone changed everything between us. The morning after that conversation, I moved through the house with an unsettled calm. The kind that comes after crossing a quiet boundary you didn't intend to cross but can't take back. Nothing had technically happened, yet the air around me felt different, charged with awareness I hadn't felt in years. I kept replaying his words, the way he looked at me, the gentleness in his voice when he admitted he cared more than he should. It wasn't something I could dismiss. It lingered like a soft echo under every thought. My husband returned late the night before, too tired to notice anything unusual. Or maybe he simply wasn't looking. I watched him move around me with the same distracted routine, and for the first time the absence of his attention felt louder than ever. I wanted to tell myself that what I felt for Daniel, whatever it was, came from loneliness, not from him. But deep down I knew that wasn't the full truth. It wasn't just that Daniel noticed me. It was that I noticed him back. A few days passed before I saw him again. I wasn't expecting him, but when the doorbell rang and I opened it to find him standing there, rain dusted across his jacket, something inside me tightened. He said he came to return a book my husband had lent him, but the way his eyes searched mine told me that wasn't the only reason. I stepped aside and let him in, unsure whether it was the right thing to do, but unable to stop myself. He looked around the house as if testing the distance between us. I offered him a place to sit. He hesitated before accepting, as though sitting too close might say something he wasn't ready to say. I sat across from him, but even that felt too close for the amount of unspoken truth between us. He asked how I'd been, voice low and careful. I told him I'd been thinking, and he nodded as if he already knew. He said he hadn't been able to stop thinking either. There was no hesitation, no attempt to hide it. He said he felt guilty for putting me in a difficult position, yet he couldn't pretend nothing had shifted between us. His honesty disarmed me. I told him I didn't blame him. I told him the shift didn't come from him alone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy with everything we weren't saying. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers intertwined tightly, as if holding himself back. He admitted that he had cared for me quietly for years, long before he ever let himself acknowledge it. He said it wasn't intentional. It was something that grew in the spaces my husband never filled. Hearing that should have frightened me. Instead, it felt like someone had finally spoken a truth I had sensed but never dared to name. I told him he didn't imagine the distance in my marriage. I said it plainly without trying to soften it. The words felt like stepping across an invisible line. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, hope mixed with restraint. He didn't move toward me. He didn't reach out. But he didn't hide the longing either. When I placed my hand on the edge of the table, his eyes followed the movement before meeting mine again. Slowly, carefully, he placed his hand close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from it but not touching me. It was a question without words that I didn't pull away, that I didn't close the gap either. But by allowing our hands to hover just close enough to tremble from the tension, I gave him an answer neither of us admitted aloud. And then my phone rang. My husband's name lit up the screen. The sound cut through the moment like a blade, reminding me exactly what line I was standing on. I answered with a steadiness that didn't match the chaos inside me. When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly. Unable to look at Daniel, he stood up first, clearing his throat softly. He apologized, not for what he felt but for complicating my life. I told him he hadn't forced anything. The truth was already there. He nodded, eyes darker with understanding, and said he would give me space. When he left, he didn't look back. But the moment he walked out, I realized space wouldn't be enough to undo what had just happened. Nothing could. The house felt unbearably quiet after he left, as if the air itself had been holding its breath while he was here and only exhaled when the door clicked shut. I stood in the same spot for several minutes, trying to understand the weight in my chest. It wasn't guilt alone. It wasn't desire alone. It was recognition of what I had allowed, what I had wanted, and what I could never pretend away again. I didn't regret the honesty between us, but I couldn't deny the consequences that came with it. My husband returned home later than usual that evening, tired and distracted the same way he always was. He asked about dinner without noticing the tension in my posture, or the distance in my expression. I watched him move around the kitchen, opening cabinets, checking emails, muttering about deadlines. It was strange how ordinary everything looked while my entire world had quietly shifted hours earlier. I found myself studying him the way someone might study an old photograph, searching for traces of what once felt familiar. I realized how much effort I had spent convincing myself that things would get better, that he would eventually notice the small ways I was fading. He never did. And now, after what had unfolded with Daniel, I couldn't pretend that emotional neglect was normal anymore. Days passed in a quiet blur. I avoided calling or texting Daniel, and he respected the distance, even though it made the silence between us feel like an unanswered question. My thoughts kept looping back to the moment our hands almost touched, the way his voice had softened when he said he cared. I wasn't trying to feed the feelings, I was trying to understand them, trying to understand myself. Eventually, the weight became too much to carry alone. One evening, while my husband sat scrolling through his phone, I told him we needed to talk. He looked up reluctantly, as if I had interrupted something important, though he wasn't doing anything meaningful. I spoke calmly, not accusingly, explaining how unseen I'd felt for years, how disconnected we had become, how I couldn't continue living in a marriage where I felt like a background detail. He grew defensive as expected. He said work had been stressful, that I was overthinking, that marriages go through phases. But even in his explanations there was no real emotion, no fear of losing me, no urgency to fix what was breaking. Just excuses layered over exhaustion. And that told me everything I needed to know. That I didn't mention Daniel. The emotional distance in my marriage existed long before that moment with him. What happened between us was a symptom, not the cause. I simply told my husband the truth. I needed change, whether that meant rebuilding from the ground up or walking away. He didn't give me an answer. Not that night, not the next. His silence was its own response. A few days later, I stepped outside for fresh air, trying to clear my thoughts. As if pulled by some quiet gravity, I found myself messaging Daniel, asking if we could meet, not to cross lines, but to talk openly one last time. He agreed without hesitation, but his reply carried restraint, as if he didn't want to assume anything when we met. He didn't reach for me or expect anything from me. He simply listened. I told him I needed to choose a path for myself, not for him, not for my husband. He nodded with an understanding that felt gentle rather than demanding. He said whatever direction I chose, he wanted it to be one where I didn't shrink to fit someone else's neglect. I thanked him. Not for his feelings, not for the tension between us, but for the simple fact that he saw me when I had forgotten how to see myself when we parted ways. There was no dramatic confession, no impulsive closeness. Just two people acknowledging a truth that changed them both. As I walked home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. The moment I caught him that evening wasn't a mistake. It was the moment that exposed the cracks I had ignored for too long. I didn't know exactly where my path would lead, but for the first time in years, I knew it would be a path I chose for myself.